In this video, I won't necessarily talk about the worst cards ever, and instead, talk about cards that are so bad, they were most likely designed to be bad as a joke, because Konami likes to create bad cards sometimes, for various reasons. At number 10, we've got Boycotton. Boycotton is a card with an incredibly high defense for a level 4 monster, clocking in at 2500, but you take any battle damage your opponent would have taken with this card. So, if your opponent does ram into it with a low attack monster, you don't even get any reflect damage off of it. And on top of that, if it does survive a battle and you took damage from that battle, it gets returned to your hand. Now, there is a thing with some level 4 monsters having bad effects in exchange for high stats, like Goblin Attack Force or Chainsaw Insect, but it's very rare for cards to have negative effects for having high defense. But because the card is so bad, you can give it to your opponent with Creature Swap, attack into it to do damage to your opponent, and then get the card back to your hand. Also, it only returns to your hand if it does damage to you with its effect. So, if you have Spirit Barrier on the field, it won't bounce itself back. So if you really want, you can make this card somewhat useful. At number 9, we've got Foolish Revival. This card summons a monster from your opponent's graveyard to their side of the field. This card is possibly a joke card in reference to Foolish Burial, an actual good card. Konami likes to print bad versions of good cards as jokes, which you'll see a lot more of in this video. On the surface, there's really no benefit for you to revive an opponent's monster and essentially go -2. But there are ways to use this effect to your advantage. You can revive the monster to a zone Topolopic points to banish all spell and trap cards, or to special summon a monster to an adjacent zone YuGiOh is in to proc his effect to destroy all the cards in that zone. Funny enough, there was a newer card released called Remote Rebirth, which is strictly a worse version of Foolish Revival, as it has the same effect. Except you can only revive an opponent's monsters that one of your Link monsters point to. So let's just say number 9 is actually both of these cards. Number 8, Symbol of Friendship. This card has an effect that can only be activated if you draw the card and have a clear monster field while your opponent controls 3 or more monsters. Then, once all of these conditions have been fulfilled, you get to search one card from your deck. So don't get me wrong, being able to search any card from your deck is a good effect. It's just for the conditions needed to fulfill that effect, it's kind of lackluster. Take Goddess of Sweet Revenge for example. It has a hard to pull off effect condition, but if you do pull it off, it can turn the game around for you and win you the duel by itself. Symbol of Friendship isn't really that kind of effect though, but it's almost equally as hard to pull off, which makes me think Konami just kinda printed it as a joke card, in reference to the anime where they draw the perfect card they need whenever they think of their friends. The most useful application of this card is probably just having Diamond Dude being able to use its effect without the cost. Number 7, Aitsu. Aitsu is a level 5 normal monster with 100 attack and defense, the absolute worst stat line on a normal monster that requires a tribute to bring out. This card does have a union component card called Koitsu, who, if attached, gives Aitsu 3100 attack and piercing damage. But Koitsu is just as bad, being a level 10 monster with 200 attack. There's also Soitsu and Doitsu, who are similar except aren't over level 5 and easier to work with. These cards are all basically joke cards, and are modeled after characters from a game Konami made. Now, if you wanted to make actual use of Aitsu, there are a lot of ways to cheat him out. Being fairy type means it can be special summoned from the hand with Valhalla or Ancient Rules, and from the graveyard with the mini graveyard special summon traps, including the lesser used Limit Reverse and Birthright. Although, for all the setup required, only getting a beat stick with piercing damage isn't really worth it. Number 6, Sparks. Sparks is the lowest amount of life point damage a spell card provides, at only 200 points of damage, and is the definition of a bad card. Although it's so bad, it was most likely created to be a bad card. In a lot of the Yu-Gi-Oh games, you could get a special bonus for winning a game with Spark's effect damage, because they were very aware of its terrible status and how hard that would be to pull it off. But at the very least, Sparks has a positive effect. It's an incredibly underwhelming effect, but it does do something to hurt your opponent, which is not really something that can be said about the next few cards on the list. Number 5, Self-Mummification. This card allows you to send one of your monsters to the graveyard, for no effect. Also, since the card is not destroyed or tributed, it doesn't activate a lot of the effects that monsters who like to be destroyed get, like Fire Kings or the Heretics. It's just sent to the graveyard directly, bypassing any kind of removal. This card is most likely a lore-related card for Skull Servant, and probably shows his origins of becoming a zombie. Usually, these intentionally bad cards are a reference to other cards, but I can't really find anything this effect is similar to, besides maybe being the opposite effect of Tribute to the Doom. Now, there are some possible positive uses for this card's effect. For one, you can use this card on Fortune Lady Light to gain its effect, as it's really easy to miss the timing on Lady Light's effect. Since Self-Mummification doesn't have any extra effects, you won't miss the timing. Since this card effect is quick play, you can use it on Moonlit Papillon to gain its effect after attacking with it in the battle phase and float into another monster. Same with Shooting Quasar Dragon in order to float into Shooting Star Dragon. And finally, you can use it as kind of a defensive play, if your opponent would banish one of your monsters with, say, an ABC Buster Dragon, to instead send that monster to the graveyard. That way it's not banished. Now, none of this is very good, but it can be used in a positive way, technically. Number 4, Cold Feet. This card, when activated, makes it so you basically can't use any spell or traps for the rest of the turn. This card is the opposite effect of Cold Wave, a banned spell card that made it so, when activated, it would lock you and your opponent out of spells and traps until your next turn. Whereas Cold Feet only affects you and not your opponent. Also, Cold Feet is probably a lore card showing how Frostosaurus came into being, or it might be like a more advanced state from Cold Wave. Now, some positive uses of Cold Feet. If used with Mystical Ref Panel during your opponent's turn, you can lock your opponent out of spells and traps for the turn, which is a good effect. Although, not very practical, as there's no good way to search out both the cards to combo them together. It can also be changed to stop the negative effects of cards from going off, like from Brain Research Lab or Lucky Punch. Number 3, the Humble Sentry. This card makes you show your hand to your opponent, then allows you to pick one card and return it to your deck. Going -2 while showing your opponent your hand is just bad all around. This card is the opposite effect of the Forceful Sentry, a banned card that lets you look at your opponent's hand and then return a card to the deck, which is a really good effect. Overpowered even, possibly one of the strongest spell cards in the game. And I guess that's why its joke version is so bad. Now, for some positive uses of the card. If you're running a deck that needs cards in the deck and not the hand, like Assault Mode cards or your Garnets, you can use this card to return them to the deck without fear of drawing them again, like if you'd used Magical Mallet, for example. I highly would not recommend this, but it is possible to use it for that. Also, you can use Mystical Rift Panel and this card to force your opponent to reveal their hand and send a card back. But this 2-card combo is a -1, and your opponent gets to choose the card sent back and not you. Number 2, Pot of Generosity. This card allows you to return 2 cards from your hand to the deck, and is the opposite effect of Pot of Greed, one of the best staples in the game's history, and currently banned. While Pot of Greed is a +1 in card advantage, Pot of Generosity is a -3 for no effect. A perfectly terrible opposite card, and technically worse than the Humble Sentry, as you lose one more card. But I guess, at least you don't have to reveal your hand to your opponent. As for positive applications of this card, well, same ones as Humble Sentry, in that you can send cards back to your deck that you don't want in your hand, like the Assault Mode cards. And that's about it. It's kinda really bad. Now for the number 1 card designed to be bad. We have Localized Tornado. Localized Tornado is the opposite card to Heavy Storm. Whereas Heavy Storm destroys all spell and trap cards on the field, Localized Tornado sends all cards in your hand and graveyard back to the deck. Oh, I'm sorry, did I say it had the opposite effect? I meant to say it has a bad effect that has nothing to do with Heavy Storm. You see, the card art for Localized Tornado has the farmer and cow from Heavy Storm and Storm in it, basically showing that the Localized Tornado takes place before those 2 cards in lore. Only, while the other 2 cards have effects that destroy spell and trap cards, Localized Tornado just returns all your cards back to your deck. That is to say, has nothing to do with spells and traps. Now, let's look at some of the positive applications of this effect. If you're running a mill/stall deck that draws a bunch of cards, you can use Localized Tornado to prevent yourself from decking out. And you only need to do it one time, and with as few cards in your hand as possible to get its full benefit. And outside of that one legitimate use, it's basically just a bad meme card designed to be bad. Alright, and that's it for the video. Are there any more bad cards that were most likely designed to be bad that I missed? Let me know in the comments, as well as ideas for future videos.